21st lesson looks at Theodore Roosevelt's progressivism. Roosevelt was, of course, the first progressive president, someone we've talked about in many lessons so far, but now we're just going to analyze both the strengths and weaknesses and overall effectiveness to the progressive movement of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt pioneered something what he called new nationalism. Okay, he was the 26th president of the United States, and his new nationalist variety of progressivism was based around the concept that he wanted to increase regulation on banks, on trusts, and on corporations to reduce the amount of corruption, amount of abuse that these corporations are bringing onto America. It was his sort of vision, was to increase the size and scope of government in terms of overall regulating the marketplace. Roosevelt, and it's arguable that he was actually quite successful in large part because of the way he came to the presidency. Firstly, Roosevelt did not have to run in an election to become president of the United States. He was vice president on the McKinley ticket. However, when McKinley was elected or was assassinated in 1901, Roosevelt took over. One of the key things that differentiates Roosevelt, and perhaps allowed him to be a little bit more maverick in his policies, was the fact that unlike McKinley or unlike any of the predecessors as president of the United States, he did not have to, or he was not beholden to the degree that they were to the corporate interests that fund a presidential campaign. Therefore, for everything he did, he didn't necessarily always have some guy who donated millions of dollars knocking down his door and saying, why did you break a promise? Anyhow, that said, Roosevelt was also a master of populist rhetoric. He was very charming. He was a war hero from his time, particularly in Puerto Rico, leading the Rough Riders. He was a well-known character. He'd been a very successful governor of the state of New York and had done some work to tackle the boss system in New York City. So he came in with a big name. His administration would pursue some of the biggest antitrust cases in the history of progressivism. He'd take on Northern Securities. He'd take on the Swift Beef Trust. However, what it needs to be remembered is that although I'm painting this glorious picture of Theodore Roosevelt, he actually goes after fewer monopolies than his successor, William Howard Taft. And as to all of these people, both Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson, you'll have to understand that their successes always need to be weighed against their failures. Now, in his early days as president, Roosevelt will shake up American public opinion by asking for what's called the square deal for labor. In essence, this is the square deal comes from the terminology he used during the speech. Okay, and the square deal said that he would pledge to give Americans a better a government that would make it more fair, where they would prize a person's character above his class. In other words, he would end the sort of the privilege of the rich elites in American society, and as such, give power to the labor unions, which are demanding even some of the most basic things, like a basic living wage, protections against disability in the workplace, etc. Right. One of the other things that Roosevelt does that won't necessarily endear him to the rich classes of America is that he becomes the first president in the history of the United States to intervene in a labor dispute without taking the side of the employers. Every other president, and there are countless examples, we think back to the Gilded Age and the Pullman car strike, for instance, or Carnegie's United States steel plant in Pittsburgh, which was picketed by workers, how the United States government in some cases either allows a private army like the Pinkertons to go in or allows the actual army to go in and break the strike and get people back to work. In this case, Roosevelt actually sides with in this case, miners. A mining strike in 1904 had actually threatened to endanger coal supplies as the United States was approaching winter, and just about everything in America ran on coal at this particular point. Well, not only America, everywhere else. Basically, Roosevelt forced the industry leaders and the striking United Mine Workers, a union, to accept a federal arbitration, which means that a judge would go in, listen to both sides of the case, and make a decision. That decision, therefore, becomes binding. Both the employers and the laborers have to abide by it. Mine owners know that in most cases, arbitrators will look at both sides and give a deal down the middle. They're not necessarily loose to using it all, so they refuse to accept arbitration. And Roosevelt threatens to dispatch federal troops, not to break the strike, but actually seize the mine and allow the men to get back to work. As a result, the owners capitulated, and the talks led by the arbitrator results in a 10% wage raise, one of the highest in American history at this point, and the reduction of their day to a 9-hour day. This is a massive win for labor, and it shows that perhaps the progressive movement is making steps towards improving the lives of workers, and it's a big achievement of Theodore Roosevelt in his early years. Another example of his let's say popularity as a result of all of this is because Roosevelt in 1904 has to run for re-election. He actually wins on a landslide. It's 56% of the popular vote and a huge percentage of the electoral college. And his election promises at that point had been based around new nationalism and giving everyone a square deal. In 1906, he signs the Hepburn Railway Act, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, something that had been set up in conjunction with the Sherman Antitrust Act, the ability to examine the account books of powerful railroad companies, ones that had been accused of colluding to allow price increases, et cetera, et cetera. And what this was attempting to do is sort of get to the heart of one of the big concerns, particularly that of the populist movement, that of railroad transportation prices for manufactured or agricultural goods. And this sort of Interstate Commerce Commission would look into the railway books and challenge the railway companies if they found any illegalities. Another major success, and probably one of the most lasting legacies of Theodore Roosevelt, particularly if you like to go in nature or like to travel around the United States, is his efforts in regards to conservationism. He made some pretty notable strides in this regard. He's one of the first people to set up national parks on any great scale. He'll restrict private development on all sorts of government lands. We're talking about millions of acres, millions of hectares of national forests set up. 23 national monuments are set up, which become basically holiday areas for people who enjoy nature. He creates the first wildlife refuge on Pelican Island in Florida. I always find it kind of funny, actually, that he creates this wildlife refuge. And on Pelican Island in Florida, one of the people who inhabit this island is actually Al Capone. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. It's just an interesting tidbit. The government will also fund construction of reservoirs, canals, and dams. And you may be thinking, well, wait a second, don't these destroy nature? Well, in a sense, they both have, they can, dams in particular, can stop ecosystems. But what he does with the profits of those reservoirs, canals, and dams is he turns them over to provide affordable electric power, okay, to increase the amount of land that's cultivated, to increase settlement in the West. And all of these things sort of go towards benefiting the people. One of the issues, though, I suppose, is that his conservationism runs right into the sort of the face of what a lot of Americans want. Particularly capitalist Americans see the great abundance of natural resources of the United States there for their exploitation. The trees are growing for them to be cut down and then sold. The resources there for them to be dug out of the ground at the expense of the beauty of the surroundings in which they may be situated in. Many of the challenges to Roosevelt come in the form of conservation. One of the biggest examples, and Roosevelt was, I suppose in this case, unsuccessful, is the city of San Francisco required a reservoir in order to feed it with drinking water. And San Francisco was growing under quite a clip at the turn of the century. Now, the high-walled Hetch Hetchy Valley of the Yosemite National Park was, after a battle between Roosevelt and his people and the Supreme Court, was ruled to be allowed to be turned into a reservoir to provide drinking water for the people of San Francisco by the Supreme Court. So in some sense, his conservation, though quite profound, it's not a complete and utter success. Another interesting thing, which comes out of looking to bust the trusts, is food inspection. Roosevelt was very concerned about trusts in the beef industry, particularly those that involved America's sort of meat supply. And that's, of course, if you recall, is run predominantly out of Chicago. Roosevelt reads the muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. And like most Americans who read The Jungle, this book became an absolute sensation, a #1 bestseller across the United States. He was shocked about the quality of the meat supply, not necessarily just how horrible the bosses and how horrible the corporations were. What really got to Roosevelt was the fact that these corporations were not only cutting corners in terms of their labor, they were cutting corners in terms of the sanitary condition in which they kept, processed, and packaged this meat. In response, Roosevelt supports the passage of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which are acts meant to tame the abuses in the meatpacking industry in particular, and to give a government label to any food product deemed unsanitary. Now, that government label became absolutely necessary. If you didn't have that government label, you couldn't export abroad. If you didn't have that government label, people wouldn't buy it. And putting that government label and going through the process of meeting the standards put forth by the government actually increases the cost of the meat. It increases how much the corporations have to pay to process the meat, and they obviously don't like that. Nevertheless, it becomes absolutely necessary and something they must do. And it's an example of the progressives limiting corporate profits by improving the quality of, in this case, meat and Americans' food supply. Now, apart from that, probably it's safe to say that Roosevelt's further reforms are somewhat limited. The major thing that will limit his ability to continue reforming as a progressive is the Panic of 1907, but I'll talk about that in just a second. Roosevelt, by let's say 1905, 1906, into his second term or his first half term, was starting to come into conflict with a lot of conservatives, not only in his own party, but across the United States. Big business had rallied together against Roosevelt. They didn't like the fact that he was too progressive. They didn't like the fact that some of his actions were threatening their profits. They didn't like the fact that for the first time in U.S. history, really, they weren't able to do whatever the heck they wanted. So as a result, Roosevelt starts to realize that opposition is coalescing against him. And his ability to pass reforms after 1906 is, in fact, quite limited. He would love to, and he in fact calls for further reforms, including the regulation of the stock market, the introduction of a graduated income tax, tax on inheritance, workers' compensation for accidents in the job, and an 8-hour workday, but will likely, in these cases, not see them. His predecessor Taft will pick up on Roosevelt's reforming zeal and actually pass a lot of these, but Roosevelt will be limited. And the major reason he's limited, as I alluded to, was the Panic of 1907. This is oftentimes known as the Roosevelt Panic. This is a name, and the name, the Roosevelt Panic, speaks to a point I made just a few minutes ago. The fact that there was a huge opposition group, predominantly among big business, coalescing against them means that huge amounts of money, millions and millions and millions of dollars, are spent on lobbying government, on lobbying newspapers, and creating buzz against Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, the idea that the panic is named the Roosevelt Panic isn't something that economists gave to Roosevelt. It's something that his opponents in Wall Street, particularly J.P. Morgan, who ironically he'll have to use to save the 1907 panic, will give him. They will blame Roosevelt for the panic / recession of 1907. And the name sticks, and Roosevelt sort of gets labeled with this, tarnished with the brush of having led to the 1907 panics, when in reality, it wasn't necessarily the government's fault. The panic proves, in fact, that the government has almost no regulatory power over the financial sector. And when the panic hits and banks start to go out of business, the Wall Street doesn't look to the government to help. It has no ability to do that. It looks within itself to regulate the crisis. A lot of bankers will point to, well, it's all these progressive reforms are costing us a fortune, and this led to the economic downturn, though it's not actually the case. What ultimately happens in the 1907 panic is Roosevelt has to turn to financiers like J.P. Morgan, the richest man on Wall Street, in his bank, J.P. Morgan, which will bail out failing financial institutions. The 1907 panic is caused by the fact that many banks start to run out of money. The companies they invested in aren't doing so well, and they find themselves leveraged or in debt beyond what they can pay. Morgan pools the resources of the New York banks and lends these to the failing banks. Okay, in effect, that prevents people from losing their money as banks fail across the United States. Part of the deal for doing this, though, being the savvy man that J.P. Morgan is he sits down with Roosevelt and says, okay, I will save the American banking system if you do not pursue a good degree of your progressive reforms, and more particularly, do not pursue an antitrust suit, which he was trying to put against the United States Steel Company. You'll recall perhaps that Andrew Carnegie had sold the U.S. Steel Company to J.P. Morgan at the turn of the century. And the U.S. Steel Company had gone under J.P. Morgan and purchased the shares of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, something that one of the producers that feeds the steel plant. Now, Morgan will successfully present the acquisition as an act of goodwill. Okay, that would shore up Tennessee Coal and prevent it from failing. Okay, because of the panic that he, quote unquote, Roosevelt had created. In reality, it was just another way of establishing a monopoly over the coal, iron, and steel production in the United States. Roosevelt will have to accept that in order to end the panic, he's going to have to back off his antitrust legislation. And in many ways, in actual fact, there are more trusts formed under Roosevelt than under McKinley, his predecessor. And one of the biggest reasons why is that Roosevelt has to back off his antitrust legislation because of the deal made to end the Roosevelt panic, or the panic in 1907. From that point on, Roosevelt promises that he will not run for another term, which leaves the fact that in 1908 they're going to go into another presidential election. Roosevelt chooses his successor, Taft. Taft was a progressive. Taft was a Republican. Taft was a very valuable ally to Roosevelt in Congress. And Roosevelt had become close and personal friends with William Howard Taft, and basically had said that I will not run again in 1908. You should take the mantle, effectively carry the torch of progressivism. Okay. However, by the time the 1908 election rolls around, and Taft wins, Roosevelt and Taft are starting to fall out. Now, all of the fallout would be exacerbated during the presidency of Taft, which lasts between 1908 and 1909 into 1912 and 1913 before he's eventually replaced by Wilson. Now, of course, we know that the elections happen in even years and the replacement of the president happens in an odd year. So the election of 1908 yields a new president in 1909, and the election of 1912 will yield a new president in 1913. Anyhow, all that said, and we'll cover this in greater detail, there are a number of things that Taft did that angered Roosevelt. Number one, he didn't reduce tariffs enough, something Roosevelt wanted to do. There's a rift over conservation, with Taft siding with an anti-conservationalist. Now, conservation had been one of the points of pride of Roosevelt and his presidency, and Taft sought to undo some of those. Or at least Taft sided with a man who sought to undo some of those. In fact, Taft will sack some key appointees, including the head of the Forest Service, and a guy named Gifford Pinchot in 1910. And Roosevelt hates the fact that Taft starts getting rid of his guys. And he will also begin to side with non-progressive Republicans, particularly the Speaker of the House from 1910 to 1912, and cause a rift in the Republican Party that will ultimately cause a rift in the friendship between Roosevelt and Taft. And Roosevelt will reemerge and run against Taft in the 1912 election. We'll talk now about that 1912 election. This is something we're going to cover in the Taft lesson as well. It becomes known as the Bull Moose campaign. And the Bull Moose campaign is known as such because Roosevelt calls himself a bull moose, a man who has the energy of a bull moose. Why is Roosevelt running again in 1912? And why isn't he running as a Republican? Well, here it is. Roosevelt will split the Republican Party. He comes back and tries to challenge Taft for the leadership of the Republican Party in their convention in 1912. Taft will have none of it, refuses to step aside for Roosevelt, and the Republican Party votes Taft in as their candidate. Roosevelt, angered, frustrated, prideful, decides to jump ship and joined the newly formed Progressive Party. The Progressive Party was led by Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, one of the big reformers of the progressive era at the state level, but chose to back Roosevelt because he was a bigger name, especially nationally. La Follette was considered a little bit too far out. Roosevelt himself was still quite popular, and they thought, well, this is our chance. Even though La Follette's a good guy, let's give the mantle to Roosevelt. He can run. The reality of all of this is the progressives and the Republicans primarily attracted the same voters. And what they did is those who liked Roosevelt supported Roosevelt. Those who were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans and liked Taft a bit supported Taft. And it really split the Republican vote. What you get as a result is the Democrats winning for the first time since Grover Cleveland. And that's a big deal. In fact, when Woodrow Wilson wins the 1912 election, almost by mistake, he's a minority president, one of the very few cases in U.S. presidential history where the president is not the winner of the popular vote. I can think of one very recently, in fact, the election of Donald J. Trump as president of the United States in 2016. Date that will live in infamy. Anyhow, moving on, the 1912 election is quite interesting. As I said, the progressives split the vote. It's also a clear victory for progressive policies, a point I'll allude to and make sense of a little bit later. But what you need to remember is that Roosevelt's a progressive, Wilson is a progressive, and Taft, even though he errs on the conservative side, is essentially a progressive. He did quite a lot. And we'll talk about him in the next lesson. This effectively, and if you want to draw a line under the Gilded Age, and if you want to say when did the Gilded Age end? It ended in the 1912 election. There were no sort of the influence of the big businesses of the Gilded Age is certainly no longer evident in politics by 1912. If America is going to move forward, if you're going to get elected president, you basically have to be progressive at this particular point. Now, what is the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt? Massive question. Roosevelt lost the election in 1912, but he remained a pretty legendary figure in American political history, always hanging around the periphery, putting his 2 cents in. He won't be a big fan of Wilson. They don't really get along that much. Particularly Roosevelt won't like Wilson's intervention in the First World War, and he'll do a lot to undermine Wilson, but hey, that's neither here nor there. Wilson actually has 2 quite successful terms as president. His notable successes, the antitrust initiatives, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, the aforementioned ones, the conservation, food inspection, labor rights and protections. He argues for a reduction in tariffs, but that will actually be realized only under Taft. Roosevelt, therefore, as some historians have said, encouraged reform rather than making substantial progressive inroads himself. The one exception where he's really a groundbreaker is in terms of conservation, and this has real and lasting impacts to this day. In fact, if you go to Mount Rushmore, a national park and a national monument that he created, his face is carved into the side of Mount Rushmore with other great American presidents like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, perhaps who did more in their time for America, but Roosevelt's sort of lasting impact in terms of conservation, the very existence of the Mount Rushmore National Monument, is that the doing of Roosevelt, and as such, he is enshrined in it. Anyways, it's probably best to describe him, as Alan Brinkley, the historian, describes him, as a champion of cautious, moderate change. The other thing we have to remember is that all of this great talk about Roosevelt, even though he was cautious and moderate, need to be balanced against the limits on his legacy. The 1907 panic, I think, is a wonderful counter-argument in any exam question about the effectiveness of Roosevelt. A true reformer, one may argue, does not compromise one's ideals in the face of crisis. And Roosevelt, facing a crisis with banks potentially going out of business in 1907, compromises his ideals, particularly over the reining in of big corporations. Remember, his whole concept of new nationalism is built around the idea that they will regulate corporations. And in the 1907 panic, he has to, in order for J.P. Morgan to bail out failing banks, say, in fact, I will not regulate corporations at all. I, in fact, will back away from regulation or the use of the Sherman Antitrust Act, as I was intending to do over U.S. Steel in 1907, and allow a monopoly over the steel, coal, and iron business in America to grow to exponential proportions. It's a big example of a limit on Theodore Roosevelt's progressiveness. He has a reputation, perhaps even somewhat of an undeserved one, of a great champion of progressive reform. However, it's probably more based around the fact that, you know, almost no progressive reform had happened before Roosevelt, and the fact that he did some shows him, upon reflection, to be so much better than those who had preceded him. But when you consider his achievements and you weigh them against that of Taft or most particularly Wilson, Roosevelt's achievements are, in effect, somewhat limited. You could argue that Roosevelt perhaps kicked the can down the road a little bit and allowed Taft and Wilson to have an easier job at passing progressive reform. But at the same time, you could argue that Roosevelt didn't also go that too far. Also important to remember about all three presidents, but more particularly Wilson, but nevertheless, Roosevelt is absolutely silent on civil rights. All of the progressive reforms and making life better for American citizens, again, tend to be aimed at that sort of white middle class America, the one in his mind. He's almost he's completely ineffectual on civil rights. He does nothing to help blacks, particularly blacks who are facing the imposition of the Jim Crow segregation laws in the South. Roosevelt is completely silent on that. And in fact, blacks regress in their rights as American citizens during the progressive period. And that is the same for Roosevelt, Taft, and perhaps even stronger for Wilson. But it's an important limit on any legacy of a progressive president, and something you need to consider when weighing up whether you think Roosevelt was a great progressive or not. That is the lesson.